Is it getting hot in here?
So we've established that pollution is an example of a negative externality, which is an example of a market failure, which results in the market producing the wrong or socially inoptimal amount of a good. Among the solutions to this are based on Ronald Coase's theorem. So let's talk about how cap and trade traces back to Ronald Coase and his theory of what causes pollution and what can be done about it. To set it up, in certain situations, the private sector can solve externalities without outside intervention. But there's a cost. So let's talk about those transaction costs. The costs include getting all the individuals together to communicate and make a deal. So the more people involved in an externality problem, the harder it is to solve it by getting everybody together to talk. So in 1960, Ronald Coase pointed out that in an ideal world, the private sector could indeed deal with externalities under certain conditions. And those conditions are low enough transaction costs so that people can work amongst themselves for an efficient solution. Coase reasoned that if we can assume that people want to find an improvement to their life, they will seek out mutually beneficial deals, if they exist, that lead to the same outcome as an outside governmental agency regulating it. For example, a family agrees to stop playing loud music during their next-door neighbor child's nap time in exchange for use of the lawnmower. I had a situation almost just like this. So without the government, we can maybe imagine that the two parties would get together and talk about their grievances, their issues, and one of two things could happen, or maybe more, but here's two interesting things that could happen. The music playing neighbor can pay the other neighbor for the pain that they are causing, or the neighbor with a child can pay the loud music people to reduce the volume or stop playing during certain hours, or something like this, and a nice quid pro quo. We don't actually know who owns the lawnmower, so we don't know if it's getting asked for or getting paid. And that actually is a very interesting finding. It does not matter who holds the initial rights. The solution happens either way. So how can this be used for our pollution solutions? Well, I'm glad you asked. The cap and trade or marketable permit program or tradable pollution permits is a system where the government sets a limit and then establishes tickets to pollute, and then firms trade with each other, or countries trade with each other, or environmental groups buy these up so that no more pollution can happen. It's a very flexible, sort of abides by some of the rules of the market solution that economists really like. You can see here when the U.S. instituted the world's first cap and trade program for sulfur dioxide, what happens. It was instituted in 1990, and you can see that the price of sulfur dioxide pollution permits varies with market conditions. And that's actually one of the very best things, because you want the flexibility and the ability of firms to look for the cheapest way to abate their pollution, whether it's buying up permits or whether it's modernizing their own equipment or producing less or whatever it is. It's it's an innovative and interesting approach. And like Ronald Coase, he argued it doesn't matter who is assigned or who owns the initial rights. Notice here we've given rights to polluters rather than to victims, which is a breakthrough. But it's much easier to grant property rights to polluters than it is to everybody else who sort of enjoys clean air and clean water. That doesn't mean this is all going to be a cakewalk. You've still got to reduce the cost of communication between parties. And so in this case, it's up to the government to do that. And the high cost of making legally binding agreements. It can be very expensive to make an effective agreement that is able to be taken seriously.